Of all the siding panels in the Celect product line, the shake panel is probably the easiest to install. Now, even though this panel is manufactured of cellular PVC, and therefore, as always, it's critical that we manage the expansion and contraction of the product when we install it, this management is done differently. The first indication of that's probably the fact that there aren't any nail slots in the panel. The panels are much shorter, they're only 4 foot in length, and the seams don't interlock, they merely overlap. All this means that each panel expands and contracts less and independently of each other. Wall preparation is similar to the other Celect profiles. There should always be a weather-resistant barrier system underneath the siding. Furring strips should be installed around all windows, doors, and outside corners. That will bump out the Celect trim and create the necessary pocket to hide the expansion gap of the siding panels. And the same starter strip is used. Now at this point, it really would be a good idea to go back and review the Celect wall preparation video that's part of this series for more details. I also want to point out that this decrease in panel movement in relation to the longer length panels opens us up for some other options for trim. I'll cover those a little bit later in the video. Let's get started installing some of the panels. Install the first panel by locking it down onto the starter strip. Position the panel so that the left end is about 3/8 of an inch from the furring strip. This 3/8 of an inch gap will be the same gap that you'll use for expansion and contraction throughout the entire installation. We can now fasten the panel. We're going to fasten the panel by placing fasteners about every 10 or 11 inches apart. Or in a full panel, that's 5 per panel. 1 in the middle and 2 on either side of that. Just take the nail back so that it's about flush with the top of that nailing hem, and stay about 2 inches or so from either end of the panel. We can now continue and install the rest of the course in the same way, just locking the next panel down onto the starter strip. Now this is very important. If the temperature is about 70 degrees Fahrenheit or above at the time of the installation, leave about 1/8 of an inch gap between the two panels, or this keyway should be about 1/8 of an inch wide. If the temperature at the time of installation is below 70 degrees Fahrenheit, increase that to 1/4 of an inch. The next thing that you'll notice on every panel is that there's a little mark about 15.5 inches from the left end of each panel. That mark, or indexing mark as we call it, is there to make it easier to install each course of siding without having any of the keyways line up. In other words, we want them to be offset, as they would if you were installing individual shakes. The way to use that indexing mark is like this. Place your tape on that mark, measure over to your furring strip, and then subtract that 3/8 of an inch, as you remember, for the expansion and contraction of the panel, and use that for the length of your starting panel. And take the measurement off the entire end, or the complete end of the panel. Once you've cut the panel, you can install it. Lock the panel down onto the course below it and align the end of the panel with that indexing mark. Make sure that you still have your 3/8 of an inch gap over on the other end. Now we can fasten this panel. Again, remember, keep about 2 inches in from both ends. Keep the fasteners about 10 inches apart, and try to keep at least 2 fasteners per panel. When gathering the measurements to go around a window, for example, there are a couple things that we need to remember. First of all, the width of this last keyway, or the distance between these two panels, depending upon what the temperature is outside. Next, that 3/8 of an inch gap for expansion and contraction around all the openings. And that 3/8 of an inch gap applies underneath the window as well, because that'll allow you to get the panel in and down onto the locking mechanism. Now obviously we've cut the nail hem off of the area of the panel that's underneath the window. We still need to secure that back to the wall to keep the panel nice and flat against the wall. A couple different ways to do that. First, you could take a nail and just align it along the top cut edge of that panel nail that back and allow the head of the nail to kind of keep that flush against the wall. Or you could pre-drill holes into the panel itself and secure it that way. Now, if you've cut the entire length of the nail hem off, such as under maybe a double or a triple window, you'll definitely want to pre-drill the holes and fasten the panel that way. I like to use stainless steel trim nails for this because they're smaller, and I could pre-drill if I have to in the keyways, and that way when I put the stainless steel trim nails in there, they're a little bit less conspicuous, say on a second-story window or something like that where you're going to be maybe seeing inside the trim from the ground. If you're installing Celect shake siding on an entire wall or an entire home, chances are good you'll run into this situation where you need to carry it across a doorway. And for obvious reasons, we don't want to lose track of our reference marks. That way, when we install the shake siding up both sides of the doorway and carry that across the top, our reference marks continue the way they should, and no two keyways will align with each other. Well, the best way to take care of that is to install your first course of siding up to the doorway, and then take a measurement from the closest reference mark to the doorway across the opening in increments of 49.5 inches. In this case, I went across 99 inches, placed a mark on the wall, measured back to the doorway, subtracted my 3/8 of an inch for the expansion and contraction room, so everything will continue up the wall as it should. When you reach the top of the wall or underneath the soffit area, chances are you'll be removing the nail hem of the entire course of shake siding. And there's a couple different ways to handle this top course application. If a trees board is desired, install the furring strip underneath the soffit area, measure for the panel allowing for a 3/8 inch gap, pre-drill the siding panel every 10 or 11 inches or so that we can fasten it to the wall, and then nail it. Now, one thing to note, depending upon how far down or close to the nail hem of the panel below the cut is, you may want to shim the panel a little bit behind it to keep its profile the same as the rest of the wall. In other words, so it doesn't tilt in too far. And then just fasten the panel and install whatever freeze board or trim board that's desired by the customer. If this application isn't what is desired, and maybe something a little smaller is in order, you can use the finish board. If you use the finish board, the application is pretty much the same, except that you're going to want to measure from the soffit down and allow 1 1/8 inch space from the soffit to the top of the panel. Pre-drill the panel again, nail the panel, and again, if you want, you may want to shim that panel out a little bit behind it to keep the profile exactly the same as the rest of the panels in the wall. And then the finish board can be applied directly underneath the soffit area and give it a little bit different type of look. Application up a rake is very simple. First of all, there's no need for a trim board unless you want one. Of course, if you do, you'd install the furring strip first, then the siding panels, and then the trim after that. Whether you do or you don't, make sure that all the PVC material is at least 1/2 of an inch up off of the shingles, and then fasten the panels accordingly every 10 or 11 inches or so. Gables are likely a part of your siding project. When installing the shake panels in Gables, there are a few things that you need to remember. First of all, the sheathing. The sheathing must be solid and nailable. Because we're fastening these panels every 10 to 11 inches, we need something solid to fasten to. That means that materials like foam or Celect aren't appropriate. The next thing is weather protection. You'll notice that on my sample wall I don't have any. You do need to have a weather protective barrier such as a house wrap with appropriate flashings in Gables, just like you do the remainder of the wall. The next thing would be trim options. You'll remember back in the beginning of the video I mentioned that unlike the long length panels, the shake panels being 4 foot long and hard fastened don't need nearly the space or the gap between the end of the panels and the trim for the expansion and contraction of the product. With the shake panels, we only need 3/8 of an inch. Well, that opens us up to some different trim options. Of course, if we still want to have a wide freeze board, we could install whatever width of freeze board we like. But if that's not desired, you want something smaller, that 3/8 of an inch allows us to use products like the finish board. The finish board obviously has a much shallower pocket. In the case of the finish board, I would measure down about 1 7/16 inches from my soffit, install the panels, and then go back and install the finish board over top of that to hide that 3/8 inch gap, and fasten those with either the Pro plugs or the Cortex screws and plugs. Lastly are our reference marks. We want to make sure that we keep track of our reference marks. Again, the reference marks are there so that no two keyways will align with each other course to course, so it's very important that we keep track of that. I think the easiest way to do that in a gable is to create yourself a template with a short piece of the panel. Align that template up with the angle of the panel below it. That'll give you something to measure from. Measure to the first reference mark on the left side of the gable, and that'll give you the measurement for the length of the panel to start that next course. Align the end of the panel with the reference mark, and we can complete the rest of the gable.